Uh, all right. Welcome, Linda Hayes and Mitch Fryling. Thanks for coming on today to talk interbehaviorism and all things Kantor and psychology. And for people who don't know either who Linda and Mitch are, just pause and go and Google them because they've both got massive academic records in their fields, and you should, if you need to know that before you start, pause and go and find it out. We're going to talk interbehaviorism. We're going to get into some detail today. If any of this is kind of interesting but it doesn't quite make sense, I think grab Linda and Mitch's book, Interbehaviorism, which I'll link to in the description. And otherwise, welcome and let's get started. Thanks for coming on.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So one thing that I really appreciate about the interbehavioral perspective is its approach to psychology as a natural science. And I wondered if you could start by just telling us like what that actually means and why you think it matters in the field of psychology.
You want to start, Mitch, or want?
You can go ahead.
The natural science emphasis and approach, it's kind of to acknowledge that psychology is a science. It's not just a practice or anything of that sort. It's not a theory. It is a science, and it has various compartments, including theory and practice, and it has an underlying philosophy, like other sciences. What it doesn't have is any suggestion of otherworldly sorts of things. It doesn't have any sort of emphasis on anything religious or spiritual or non-natural, not part of the natural world. Talk about all of that is not part of what interbehavioral psychology or interbehavioral philosophy amount to. So it's kind of both a statement about science and a rejection of certain other kinds of understandings that people have had about human beings over time.
Yeah, and I guess if we're just kind of bouncing back and forth a bit between us, one of the things that I think we really like about interbehaviorism is the thoroughness of embracing that natural science approach. So, I mean, it's really it doesn't fall off in application, for example. It doesn't fall. It's all, everything starts there. That this is a natural science approach. It doesn't involve a lot of mentalistic or any, sorry, I shouldn't say a lot. It doesn't involve any mentalistic or, as Linda said, otherworldly sort of ideas. Like, we're studying what people do in relation to their circumstances and all of that complexity. And it's not caused by anything else. It's not, there isn't some other thing, right? So I think that's a really big, it's one of my favorite things I would say about behaviorism in general. And in the interbehaviorism area, it's the extent of that being so thorough. And Kantor really, really, I mean, it is, everything starts there. It's not just some idea that's only over here in philosophy. Everything starts there. So I think that's one of the really big strengths of interbehaviorism.
And
I agree.
yeah, I guess given that some of those mentalistic concepts or those things that aren't part of a natural science view are things that are probably culturally viewed as being part of, or just viewed as being natural and normal because they've been talked about so much. What are some of the, from your points of view or from an interbehavioral point of view, what are some of the kind of problematic concepts or the things that people think are real or natural that are actually just either otherworldly or mental ideas or yeah.
Well,
Does that make sense?
The concept of causality is fundamental to this sort of duality of nature. There are causes and there are effects. And there's this nature that we're in and interacting with, and there's some other nature that is responsible for this that we're observing and interacting with. But the concept of causality, that everything is, caused by something. So you always have to find what made this happen. And in the history of psychology, what made this happen, what made behavior happen, was always localized in the person. It was in first their soul and then their mind, and now it's their brain. And so something happens in the brain and that causes behavior. Or worse still, something that happens in the mind, which isn't even something that is a natural entity, causes behavior. Or God causes behavior. But in other words, behavior is caused by something. And there's always a look for it. There's always a search for what causes it. And every time there's a search for what causes something, you end up in some other world. It's always that way. The assumptions that support it are always there. So yeah, that's the problem. That's what people think. People think they're the agents of their own action. They think they have free will. They think they have reason that is somehow given to them, that is innate. All of these things are abandoned in interbehavioral thinking.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you asked, I guess, about kind of everyday sort of maybe, instances of this. And I'm just thinking, even today, I've heard, a difficult person, like the idea that the person themselves somehow on the inside, or, there's something internal about them that's difficult or good. Someone is, oh, such a good person. Well, what are you talking about? The person isn't, the person is a person. There's not something about them, but then their personality, like personalities are assumed to be something that you have also, right? Like Linda has a personality. It's just, oh, that's Linda. Well, it's not, it's not in her, right? So there's so many
some of it is
day-to-day.
inherited. Yeah, there's another one.
There's so many day-to-day things, and then they're really quite painful because, I mean, you mentioned choice, which I think is a kind of a painful one, because the idea is that it could have been better. I could have done, I should have this, should have, could have. You kind of end up getting into these, that's where that comes from. That comes from mentalism and the idea that you were in charge there and that you made the wrong choice. And now you are to blame for it. I mean, that's heavy stuff, right? I mean, so you're just day-to-day kind of, if you're asking about day-to-day, that's day-to-day effects of not embracing a natural science approach to understanding behavior. And I think there are lots of problems with that on a kind of applied level, philosophical level, every level.
And so one of the things that stands out as you say that, Mitch, is the influence of culture and how culture sort of hides in plain sight, sitting underneath the work of scientists and the work of everyone. And what you said was a really, that Western cultural perspective of the individual is responsible. The individual, if you don't have power or money, it's your problem, it's your fault. It's not been the norm in probably most cultures throughout world history, but it's dominant in ours now. How do you, what's the kind of interbehavioral view on the influence of culture and what we need to be wary of when we're trying to do psychology as a natural science?
Well, do you want, yeah, I know you've been thinking about these things lately. Do you want to start with that, Mitch? Like,
Sure. I was just thinking while you asked the question, which now I'm not so sure that I'm even answering it, but I think oftentimes when we have talked about the role of culture in science, and Linda, be sure to correct me, it has oftentimes been that we have, and this is Kantor's work, and kind of a shared concern that when we're talking about the influence of culture, the worrisome part of that influence is the influence of kind of these ideas that we're expressing concern with creeping into all of our work as members of the culture ourselves. It's not as though we can somehow step out of, and so, we live in a world that is like that. And we live in a world that talks like that, and we talk like that, right? And it's not as though we're, can jump out of this somehow. So I think if part of what you're asking is related to making sure, and this is something that's so great about interbehaviorism and Kantor's work, is that to call attention to that and make sure that you really dial in on it, because you can't ever remove the fact that there's a tremendous influence of the cultural circumstance that we find ourselves in. And to act like science is somehow objectively outside of that, or could even possibly be outside of that, would only, and this is something you really taught me, Linda, would only further make sure that that problem persists, right? To act as though science could somehow step out of it. And then I think what we have to do is try to study that as best we can. And if part of it is you're talking about cultures evolving and changing a little bit too, well, I think that's part of what we have to figure out how to study and to best understand that. And I'll stop now.
yeah, I'm thinking along the same lines as you, Mitch, but also, it's we have an individual history as a scientist, and we have a cultural history as a scientist, and those histories, and we are the sort of current point in our development. We are a current point in the development of that history. We are that history. So we can't walk away from it. We are that history. That is who we are. That is how we now act, is given that we have these histories. And like, as Mitch was saying, we can't walk away from it. And so we have to study it. But I think the other thing to think about there is the concept of influence. The culture doesn't really influence us. We are that in the sense that it's not separate from us and making us do something. That the concept of influence is, I mean, I know that's not how you were speaking, Mitch, but you can see how the concept of causality creeps into everything. And we are part of that. That's our field. That is the field in which we are engaging and we are acting. There's nothing making that happen.
Yeah,
that is occurring, and we're part of what is occurring. And some of that is, answers to questions we don't have, which is called religion, and things of that sort. So but being aware of it, we can't step out of it. But as Mitch was saying, being aware of it helps to constrain it from totally, debilitating scientific development. So.
I think, by the way, that's really the point that you just made about influence is really important. I mean, if we're going to kind of dig into some details today, you're right, because talking that way also implies that there's something that we're not a part of that's kind of going, coming at us and somehow impacting what we do, which would imply that we're separate from that in the first place, which of course we're not. So I think that's a great interbehavioral lesson there for sure.
Is that an example of for jumping a little bit, but of the difference between like events and description, because the word culture is different to the event, you know, culture as an event, or as a, you know, that in each of, I don't even know how to describe it now. But as you're saying that, it's like as soon as I use the word culture, it's like there's this like wind that's pushing me in a direction, rather than, yeah, this
Being
integrated, yeah, it being integrated, you know, this integrated field where culture is one of the,
there's a lot of confusion of what Kantor calls the confusion of constructs with events. So, you know, there's things and events that we're interacting with that are you know, features of this field, integrated field, and then our talking about them, and our talking about them is often confused with the events themselves. And the talk about them often induces, or, you know, evokes causal construction. It introduces things that aren't there in the events that we're trying to describe. So descriptions often contain references to things that aren't part of the events themselves, or they leave things out of the events themselves. You know what I mean? The descriptions aren't the same thing. And so that distinction, if it's not recognized, also makes for problems, makes for misunderstandings. You've written about this, Mitch.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a really great question. Because I think what you're sort of probing here is that talking about it, talking about a part of something, makes it a thing. It kind of others it as though it isn't all connected in one big integrated whole. And so anytime you kind of talk about a part, you risk the what Linda was just saying here, you risk the kind of possibility of treating that as though it's its own thing that's exerting some sort of influence or power over some other thing. So, but maybe again there, just like the previous culture example, it's not to say that's bad and to not say anything, but to just be really cautious of confusing you're talking about things with those things. And we do that all the time. I mean, and I think that's really what you're asking about, is as soon as you start talking about it, then it becomes the thing that you're talking about, and it becomes sort of detached, maybe. It can at least become detached from the larger, we would say, you know, field that you're probably interested in. If
yeah,
that's sort of
yeah, that's a neat explanation of my clumsy description. But in The Myth of Metaphor, Colin Turbane talked about how metaphors, when they start out and people know them as metaphors, they're really useful. And then he talks about using a metaphor, and then that they go to this other stage where now the metaphor is using you, he describes it as. And so whether it's like the world is a machine, or the mind-body duality, or whatever, that there's these things that start as a useful way to think about things, and then at a certain point they become like a cultural kind of that truth, and then that's when the kind of all hell breaks loose.
It's like
So
when it's like when you know, the brain is a computer. It's a metaphor, and it's complex, and so that's kind of helpful in thinking about this organ differently. But now we're looking for the wiring in the brain, you know, because we have confused the computer metaphor with the biological organ. There doesn't have any wiring, and nothing is
where is it all
going.
stored? Yeah, must be on a disk somewhere.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it's a good example of what you're saying about metaphor.
Yeah. I wanted to try to share my screen, which doesn't always work for me. And I've got a diagram of the integrated field. We'll see if that works. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Oh, good. And I don't have any embarrassing tabs open, so that's good. So I wondered if we could use this kind of diagram to just as a kind of way to talk through the integrated field concept and just see what comes out of that, because I think it's a really interesting and I just pulled this off the Interbehavioral website, which I think a few Mexican guys put together. So I don't know if how this diagram sits with your current perspective, but yeah, I'd just love you to kind of take us through some of that.
Go ahead, Linda, it's all you.
Okay. Well, our position has kind of evolved from Kantor's position to some extent on some issues. But this is Kantor's field. Okay. The one thing, I'll mention a couple of things. The interaction, the double-headed arrow here is to represent an interaction, a function. Like a line is a function in mathematics. That's the sense of the term function. It doesn't make anything happen. One thing doesn't cause the other. It's not some kind of reciprocal causality. There's only one thing, and it is that relationship between responding and stimulating. Now, in looking at that relationship for analytical purposes, you can talk about the response phase of a function or the stimulus phase of that function. So in the response phase, Kantor is wanting to say that the psychological event is not the organism. The organism is a source of responses, and which response is occurring in relation to stimulation at this moment is the response function, the RF in that. So a given organism may respond in multiple different ways with respect to a stimulus object, but on this particular occasion, in this setting, a particular responding is occurring with respect to a particular function of stimulation. So stimulation on the other side is the same way. It's not the object that is the psychological event of interest, and it's not the potential stimulation of that object that has evolved through previous interactions with responding for that organism. It is the stimulus function, is the action of that object at this moment in relation to some particular action of the organism, the response function, so that you have this one unit that you can conceptualize as occurring in a given moment in time. Now, that unit is happening in a setting. That setting is, well, let me say something about that given moment in time. That moment in time is every moment. Okay. It's this moment, it's this moment, it's this moment, it's this moment. Okay. And each of those moments includes the history up to that point for that organism. So this is talking about the behavior of an individual organism. And that organism is interacting with its environment, and every moment includes all previous moments. That is the history of the organism that is accumulating, and that interaction becoming more complex. But not everything the organism has ever done is occurring in this moment, because what is occurring in this moment has to do with the setting. The setting is the place of history, but it has different factors organized in a particular way, occurring at a particular time with respect to this organism and this object in a particular situation. And it's what particular function happens at a given moment in time has to do with that setting. It's a historical event and it's continuous. So that's kind of a long-winded way of talking about that diagram. I don't know if that made sense, but the time notion here is, you see this line here for time, that the stimulus and function and response function are, since they're one event, they happen simultaneously. They are one event. There's not first one and then the other. And so the time notion here applies to the notion that this event is historical and this event continues, but not, it doesn't represent the response coming first and then the stimulus, or the stimulus coming first and then the response, or anything of that sort. You want to throw anything else in there, Mitch? I know I just blabbed, but
Yeah, I don't know if you have any like specific follow-up question. I mean, I think
yeah, so
either. Go ahead.
sorry. So Linda, I think it's good to be clear that we're not talking about this linear, like ABC, like three-term contingency kind of idea. We're just saying that you the responding organism responds in kind of in this unitary way with the stimulating with the stimulus function, and that we kind of use time because we need a way to conceptualize it, because otherwise you're just looking at the whole universe and it's
yeah, we use time to indicate that the event is continuous.
and maybe because when we're doing we're trying to do things in regard to psychological events, we need to distinguish particular types of events that are of interest.
One event from another, yes. It's kind of, this is kind of what I'm talking about, is really the focus of a field. You need something
Yeah.
to focus on.
One kind of, yeah, one metaphor I was thinking of was if you took like a photo of a particular part of the ocean, and you're taking a snapshot of the interbehavior of plants, animals, currents, all these kind of features within a particular space, and that's affected by the whole ocean, the whole world, the whole universe. But in order to study one place, you need to you can kind of look to one place and then see how those interactions flow with other areas.
You have to see how it continues to evolve. So it's evolve mean change. So yeah. The thing that is important here is the problem with this diagram is it has this sort of linear sense to it that we're trying to avoid, right? So the preceding segment, the interbehavioral history, the history isn't gone by, you know, it's present. It's not, there is no past. You know, this is the present, and this is the present, this is the present, this is the present. And everything that has happened is coming along, is becoming present, becoming present, becoming present. So there's no past that makes you do anything. Like in behaviorism, for example, we understand behavior in terms of its history. That's a causal notion. History makes us do stuff, you know. So there's, and the succeeding segment is not like something that there's no future either, because the future hasn't happened, and it's always now, and now it's now, and now it's now, it's now, it's now. So there's no real temporal before and after here. There's one field, one event. And this is the description, and this is what we're trying to capture. Now, if you want to do research, or you want to use this interpretation for application, you're going to have to constrain that notion in some way. You're going to have to look at it in a kind of partial way. You're not going to be able to look at it in its full identity. You're going to have to limit it, study something more limited. I don't know if that makes sense, Mitch. I don't know. I saw you sort of.
Yeah, I was disagreeing with everything. I was agreeing with everything you were saying. I think, if I'm nodding my head here, there's lots of really great things about the interbehavioral field construction, and I think it is what people, if they're on a journey to understand interbehavioral thinking, this is probably the initial kind of step here. And because I think a lot of people's experiences in the world are not linear. It isn't just a consequence that determined what you, I mean, it's complicated. And that this is a more close, kind of closer to that. It's still a construct. It's still a way of talking about it. So there's that too, right? I mean, we just finished, talking about constructs and events. So, and the past and the future are constructs. That's what Linda was just referring to too, right? You can see that's a good example of when people, talk about something as a thing, and then it becomes somehow, then it has power, then we have to go find it somewhere. But like there was never a past that was somewhere other than right now. There was never a future that was somewhere other than right now too. But once we start, we give these things a lot of power. So I think it's interesting to hear you talk through this particular diagram of the field, Linda, which does have this time kind of flavor to it. And there's a little bit of a hesitation to talk about, or how to talk about that. The history's right now, the future's right now. It's all right now, happening right now. There are lots of beneficial things that we, elaborate a lot upon within this. So I don't know, I could see, well, you were saying, and I want to make sure you do that.
Well, just that, when we started talking about natural science, so there's you can have an applied interbehavioral psychology, investigative interbehavioral psychology. So, in different subdomains or different domains of the science of interbehaviorism or interbehavioral psychology, in different domains, you may have to describe events in a different way because you have different aims. And so you have to describe it in a different way in order to achieve aims of whether something works, or whether something changes in a way that you expected it to change, or how can I manipulate this field in order for something to change? How do I manipulate something to see the field reorganize in some way and become something else? So this notion of everything is now, from a philosophical standpoint, is the sort of richest expression of it. But most of us aren't in a rich philosophical world all the time. We're doing application, we're doing research, we're talking about the theory of substitute stimulation or something like that. We're doing something more limited than that.
Oh, really? I live in that world all the time, Linda. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't even know what
I don't even know what that means. Well, I think if we, what I hear is from an interbehavioral perspective, there's even some issues with this. It's but I was just thinking about an example. So I was reading a paper around a values intervention on the weekend, and it was looking at, say, whether values intervention was more effective than monetary reward in getting people to do unpleasant things, kind of thing. Whether if you could connect it to their values, it would make them more likely to do it, say. So yeah, interesting kind of study, but again, it's like it's just, say, 20 individuals. I can't remember how many. I don't know anything about their history. I don't know what their experience of doing the unpleasant things that they were asked to do in the study were. I don't know what the setting factors were. I don't know if people were tired when they got there. I don't know if people were hungry. They use monetary rewards. I don't know how much money people have. I don't know if someone's really on the poverty line, or someone's kind of got rich parents and they're They don't even use cash. So there's all these kind of things of interest to me in that just aren't even, it's just assumed that none of those matter. It's just assumed that what matters is, say, they measured people's psychological flexibility beforehand. I don't even want to get into that, but they measured people's psychological flexibility beforehand through some kind of self-measure, and then they're kind of testing what does this intervention do? Does this intervention cause people to do hard things better than money would cause them to do it? And there's just so much in a diagram like this that I think is missed in those contexts. And also I think in clinical contexts, people probably are way more attentive to history because as people, we just know that matters. But it does, yeah, there's just so much in that traditional psychological literature and even like the ACT literature where there's so many factors that are just made invisible. And I'm just going to stop talking and let you two respond.
Exactly. You're right. You're right in that, and just in the example that you're giving, all of the information that is not present to try to understand that situation. So some set of circumstances, reorganizes into the person doing something. And another set of circumstances having to do with money or promised money or values reorganizes that set of events into doing unpleasant things less readily or something like that. I mean, but what are all those things? I don't know. And I'm sure the researchers don't know. And maybe it doesn't matter because all you want to do is find something that'll will end up where you would want it to end up. But the things of like flexibility and values, these are very complex issues. Talk about cultural circumstances. There's so many issues involved. It's a simplification, let's put it that way. And maybe you can't, you study what you study, you have to isolate something to study. You can't study everything. So it's always simplified. Investigation is always simplified.
That's what I wrote down while you were talking, is, the whole independent, dependent variable thing sort of leads you to do that, right? You act as though you're studying one thing that's separate from everything else. And I guess that's sort of what people do when they do research. And the important thing is to, when you consider that, is do all the things that you did. What are all these other things happening? What other questions need to be asked about this, and careful to ascribe too much to the so-called independent, variable. That's a construct too that's used in a research situation that, I don't think there's something independent that some other thing is dependent upon. Those are, those are phrases that are used in the context of experiments for particular reasons and need to be interpreted in a larger, at least from the perspective of interbehaviorism, in a larger situation.
It's all research is the same. You just change something about the setting and see how it rearranges. It's all the same. Everything is the same. That's all it is. But so it's a matter of what you how you manipulate the setting, what you throw into it or what you take out of it, and and it sort of reorganizes as something else. And that's the effect. And what you did is the cause or the independent, dependent variable, but it's really just a sort of a manipulation of this field.
So would you say that all research in a way is, or not in a way, but all research is, what it actually is a description of the relationships between factors, or an attempt to see how different factors interact.
Yeah.
But then we pretend that we know which ones caused which other ones.
Yeah.
Or we talk that way. Pretend might be a bit harsh.
Any change in it, any manipulation to it means that it reorganizes. It's not just a bunch of things. It's also the organization of those things. So yeah, you change that the set of factors that are present, and there's the remaining factors, and that factor now reorganize as a new event. So
it takes some of the kind of I mean, even while we're talking about it, it seems like, okay, so that's what it is. That's what it is. I mean, and that's not a bad thing, you know, but it might, to people who are into, you know, you can kind of feel a balloon deflating a little bit there. Like if you're hanging on to this idea that, you know, like, oh, we proved this, or, you know, we demonstrated that X causes, you know, Y, or it takes some of the power away from the whole idea that research proved something. It is a description. And what a relief that that's what it is, right? So you can read it and know that that's what's happening. It doesn't mean that it's trivial. It's not to dismiss it, but there's a little bit less of kind of this, you know, the study on that. It's okay, study on that is a study on that. And that's, you know, you know, there's a different way of talking about it that feels different once you look at it that way. It at least that's how I kind of sense that people talk about research in a way that as though they're proving some kind of truth about something. But as a study,
it's
sorry?
all gonna keep adding it up and adding it up and adding it up.
Yeah.
Then you're gonna understand everything. But of course, that it doesn't add up. And they can't
Yeah. Yeah.
The other
again,
thing, you know, in behavioral research, this sort of notion of holding things constant while you manipulate one, you can't hold things constant. That is not what has happened.
yeah, right.
I mean, there are some, the sort of causal construction, you know, misleads you in how you think about events, you know, and how you think about how events change. It's some of the sort of, you know, most precious notions of our methodology are kind of confusions.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's why I kind of laughed a little, because it's like, gosh, so much hangs on this idea here that it's kind of seems like, I don't know, wrong or something to question such a, you know, deeply ingrained idea that, yeah, this whole causality and research thing really isn't maybe what we thought it was.
I want to read a line from your book that I think kind of fits with some of what we're talking about, and just get your get your views on it. So you write
I hope we think the same thing still.
Yeah, like you can't change. You're not allowed to change because you published it. So you're not allowed to develop any. Just dig into your belief system now and just write it. Yeah, cash in. I'm sure. So hypothetical constructs in psychology typically derived from the assumption that there is an observable and an unobservable world permeate the discipline and have prevented the development of a natural philosophy of science. Do you still agree with yourselves? And
yes, but the difference between hypothetical constructs and constructs are simply descriptions of events. Hypothetical constructs are descriptions of things that aren't events, that they're references to other verbal behavior, not other events other than other verbal behavior. So hypothetical constructs are, you know, minds and gods and spirits and, you know, special powers and will and reason and all these kinds of things. Those are not descriptions of events that you're interacting with. other than other verbal behavior. They reference other verbal behavior. So, and other verbal behavior is, well, we can get into that, but it's substitutive. And so all kinds of things can happen once you're talking about that.
So Linda, it's like if we're developing constructs to describe observed events, then that's just a construct. But if we're developing a construct that's not connected to events in that way, that would be like a hypothetical construct,
That
like
can't be contacted.
like
Yeah,
an
if they
ego
can't-
or personality type or
Yeah.
love languages or yeah.
Yeah. We've never seen a mind. We've never watched a mind. The whole idea of it is that it's some other thing. So it's, you know, it's different than constructs that are derived from events.
Mhm.
They're
And
still
you-
constructs, but the hypothetical ones are especially worrisome.
And you write that invalid philosophy is founded upon dualistic ideas and cultural folklore.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, philosophy can be anything, but a scientific philosophy can't indulge in that kind of thinking. A natural science has a philosophy that is a foundation for it. And that kind of philosophy can't, participate in made up things and hypothetical constructs and references to things otherworldly, because that violates the principal foundations for a scientific philosophy. I mean, you can have a philosophy that is not scientific and you can talk about anything. It's just not a valid scientific philosophy. It can be a perfectly valid ethical philosophy, let's say, although I don't think anything is valid really if it's made up like that. But as a scientific philosophy, you can't allow those kinds of constructions.
And philosophical constructions too. I mean, importantly, you know, we're talking about assumptions about the subject matter, assumptions about what the science is and is not. I mean, we were just talking about causality. Well, that's an unobservable construction too. Nobody ever saw that happen. I mean, where did that come from? Now, that doesn't mean it came out of nowhere. I mean, obviously, that's a very common, you know, idea, and but it's not something that was observed.
The causality part was not observed. The
Yeah.
fact that things happen in sequence and that one thing happened, another happened, and another happened, we can observe that. But the notion that one of them caused the next one to happen, it's the
Power there.
power that is the force, the power that one thing is given to produce the other that is not, you don't confront that, you know, by way of observation.
Mm. All right, so I want to jump around a little bit to, I think, the concept of, and again, we're talking conceptually, but the concept of substitute stimulation or stimulus substitution. I'm not sure what's the best way to frame it. I think is a really useful concept to describe human language and cognition and human complexity. And I was talking to Yvonne Barnes-Holmes a few weeks ago about the updates in RFT and kind of the work that she's doing in trying to bring about an applied psychology that's as close to events as close to their research as possible. Can you talk us through this concept of substitute stimulation and I guess why that's an important or useful way to think about what we do as humans?
You should go first, Linda.
Well, the concept of substitute stimulation, of course, is a very old concept. You know, I mean, something of this sort was talked about by the Pavlovians and by Kantor, and many others have talked about this sort of thing. But what it is saying is that, I'll just say what substitute stimulation is, that that one stimulus object may serve as a source of stimulation for the stimulation of another object, if in the course of an individual's history, those objects have been part of the same setting. So if I'm, because this thing is near that thing, I may see that thing when I see this thing, okay? That kind of thing. If by virtue of common spatial relation, or common temporal relation, or common physical relation, or common functional relation. Something common among things allows one thing to operate as another, okay? From an interbehavioral standpoint, since the subject of analysis is this function of stimulating and responding in this setting, you can't have a response without a stimulus, and you can't have a stimulus without a response, because they're part of the same thing. So when a person sees something in its absence, you can't just leave it at that, because you don't have responding without stimulating. You can't leave it there. You have to say, well, it's responding with respect to stimulation. Well, where's the stimulation? Well, if the original object that was the source of some sort of stimulation, the appearance of somebody or something, is not present, you have to assume that stimulation is operating from another source. And when you say that, you're talking about substitute stimulation, okay? That is, all of language is about that. All of cognition is about that. I mean, all of these complex areas of psychology are really talking about that thing. The problem with some contemporary notions on this is that it's not just stimulus substitution, it's also response substitution. In other words, it's not just one thing that is happening in this way. And I think what happens is I think what is happening in RFT, for example, who taught where stimulus substitution is derived relations. It's a way of speaking of this same subject. But RFT operates in terms of causal principles that derive from Skinnerian thinking. So the stimulus is both something that is related to responding and something that sets the occasion for responding or reinforces responding. So the stimulus ends up having sort of two roles, one of which is this notion of substitution for other things, and the other is a causal notion that comes from radical behaviorism. And that is a confusion of stimulation with the setting. Reinforcement, stimulus control, these are matters of the setting. And that's not made very clear in RFT, for example. And I'm going a little off topic here, but I want to say substitution is critical and it's important, and it's critical to all kinds of complex analyses of language and all kinds of complex behaviors, but it's not fully developed. Because well, I'm leaving. I'm just going to stop there. I'm sorry. I just kind of got a little carried away with the incomplete realization that if stimulation is substitutive, so is responding.
And you think,
it's the same thing.
And do you think, now I'm asking you a question maybe too, but I think that what you're kind of getting at is, so because this whole concept of substitution was not present from the beginning in the behavioral
Yeah.
kind of journey of research here, the idea from most behavior analysts is you kind of collect data and then you let your data, data are going to tell you the story basically, as though data sing songs and do all sorts of things. It's kind of interesting thought there, but because that concept wasn't there and because the field construct wasn't there from the beginning, that you kind of get to a point where you kind of push up against some things that really have a hard time to talk about. And that's one of them, right? Where, well, of course, this idea of stimulus substitution.
Imagining, remembering.
Yeah, imagining
all
all these
concepts.
things, right? Yeah. So it's a kind of long roundabout way of getting there when all of that seems to be about stimulus substitution.
Yeah.
And it's a really clarifying way of looking at things. This whole notion of stimulus substitution, response substitution, the distinction between stimulus objects and stimulus functions and all, it just kind of makes, oh, I have a way of talking about all that.
Without that concept, you're left trying to understand all the complex forms of behavior, thinking, imagining, dreaming, remembering, all of that. You don't have a stimulus. The stimulus isn't there, and imagining, and the past has gone by. So what's remembering about? It all ends up in the brain.
I was going to say, you got to go back to the mind or the brain or something. You got to go back to one of your crutches. Yeah.
So brain storing it all because, So it really, it's a very important concept. And it was missing in Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior is really a fabulous take on trying to deal with such a complex subject matter. It was a really outstanding historical approach to that topic, but it was missing that concept. And it was not a real paradigmatic part of that Skinner's analysis, and because of it, the analysis of complex behavior, cognitive issues never developed. It never developed adequately without that concept. So, and RFT did so.
Is that a good example of where the idea of system building and starting with like getting really clear on those underlying constructs in your philosophy and understanding the role of culture before we get into just experimenting and trying to apply things, or even using experimentation to develop those core concepts? Is that an example of where that base hasn't been established in a really effective way?
Yeah. And it doesn't happen. It's not like you have to do all that first and then you start doing experiments. It kind of happens as you go, but along the way you have to work on it. You have to work on that system because it's helpful for progress. And not a lot of work is done in philosophical system building.
Easy to overlook when you're so into the data.
Whereas if we think about like what people know about or what people remember of things like, physics, for example, the bits that most lay people remember is, those kind of laws, those core concepts that they laid down. People were laying down probably before they could do really complex experimentation, when they're like rolling rocks down hills or doing things that were less sophisticated in terms of instrumentation. But it does seem to lay a good foundation for what comes after it.
Yeah, and it has to, like everything else in science, it changes, it evolves, but it's about such broad issues that it doesn't change as quickly as the results of an experiment, but it's not static. I just read something recently about the second law of thermodynamics, and I'm not a physicist or anything, but it was a little article about this is coming into question again. It was a very important thing, and it all has to do with heat and all of this. And then it said, and it was very helpful in telling us why time only flowed in one direction. And I thought, that is the stupidest concept I have ever heard of. It. There is no time anyway. It is, it's a metric, and it doesn't flow. It was just, I thought, this is ridiculous. So whatever is happening in physics, which I know nothing about, I just happened to read this one little article. It surely that needs some evolution in thinking, but anyway.
Yeah. That's a classic example of a concept just sneaking in and pretending it's a truth or an event. Yeah. I wanted to ask about so we touched on stimulus substitution. I thought your chapter on perspective taking and on relationships was really interesting, and that perspective taking continuum. And I think I read both of your paper on that. I wonder, can you talk a bit about relationships and perspective taking from an interbehavioral point of view? Just take that wherever you want to go.
That's you, Mitch.
Well, I think the perspective taking analysis actually really builds on this topic of substitution and the whole notion of a shared relationship, and that the extent of that relationship directly relates to one's perspective taking ability. Not to say that we have abilities inside us or anything like that, but the extent to which perspective taking occurs. And so, if there are different ways of kind of characterizing a shared relationship over time along a continuum, but what's happening is that relationship's becoming more elaborate, and that the more elaborate your relationship is, the more elaborate that shared relationship is, I should say, then the more you are taking another's perspective, because it's also your perspective. And there's a lot of kind of funky issues in there, including kind of talking about the self and others, and but I think both of those topics, just relationships in general and in particular perspective taking, build on this idea of a shared history, and also has bearing on the analysis of or not so private events in our perspective that are really an issue of the extent of one's shared history with another person. I think I kind of wandered around a bit there, but
We're in a field, it's fine.
okay.
We don't need to be linear. So public-private, and we talk about that a little bit, and we'll kind of maybe bring it back to perspective taking and relationship. But yeah, can you talk more about?
Sure, I guess I'll start since I've already started, Linda, but this is the idea, to kind of paraphrase this analysis, and then maybe we can get more technical too, is that the extent to which I don't know what you're thinking right now has nothing to do with your thoughts being inside of you or private or whatever behavior analysts want to call them to give them some sort of status. it has to do with me not having a very lengthy shared history with you. And the extent to which Linda's thoughts are something I can interact with right now and see just as much as I can see that picture that's next to her on the Zoom screen here are a product of us having a rather lengthy shared history. So we don't, from that, so the kind of takeaway from that is there aren't any private events. What there are limited histories with other people. And because there are limited histories, and we just sort of say those things are private, but they're not private. They're just unavailable to us at the moment, given our limited shared history. And the longer you know someone, as many people have experienced, and kind of when there is I get this sort of problems with this distinction, people get it because most people have someone that they have a lengthy history with that they don't wonder what that person is thinking, to the extent that they wonder what a stranger is thinking, right? And so I think that's sort of the I don't want to say plain version of that analysis, but there isn't anything private from, I think, our perspective. I don't want to speak on your behalf, Linda.
Oh, yeah. No, I think I agree with what you said, Mitch, and the whole public-private distinction, that from our perspective, psychological events are, occurring in a field of interaction. They're not occurring inside the organism. What's happening inside the organism are biological events, and the putting them in there creates problems. We don't know them, we can't study them. Someday the physiologist of the future is going to tell us what's going on there, and then we'll understand what's going on in people's private world. Well, that never happened, and the physiologist didn't tell us, except that now we're imagining that we're going to study the brain, and we're going to know everything about a person, what they're thinking and what they're planning, and everything about their dreams, and what they remember, and it's all going to be in there. But what's in there, within there is just sort of biological material. It's not the history of the organism that is playing out in the whole organism's interaction with their world. So we don't really buy that public-private distinction. We've written a paper on that. It is a little bit more in depth.
Yeah. Well, and there's an important thing here, I guess, just thinking of this. We're never going to have a 100% shared history. There's always some part of your history that I don't share, and so I'll never precisely, the extent to which your thoughts are public, the specificity with which the exact words with which those thoughts are, that, there will always be, nobody has a completely shared history. So in that sense, there are things that the degree of the specificity can't be 100%, right?
Yeah, otherwise there's you'd have to be inside. You'd have to be one person.
Literally, be the other person.
Yeah, not just in a philosophical sense. So just to pull that apart a bit, could we say that you and Linda have spent, you've been in space-time together a lot and had a wide variety of different interactions, and so you've seen Linda's facial expressions, and you've seen Mitch's body language, and then they've said what they were thinking or feeling, and so then just to make it really crude, it's like those conditions of association have developed through that history to the point where Linda frowning and you having a sense that she's thinking or feeling a particular thing just kind of happen as one event. When, say, I'm meeting you both for the first time and I don't know what you're thinking about a particular thing or feeling.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know what stimuli substitute for other stimuli for you.
Yeah.
You know, in that sense, going back to substitute stimulation.
Yeah, yeah. And so when I say, when I use a word, you won't know what that particularly means in my experience, in the way that my wife would, or my kids would, or someone else would, and vice versa. Yeah. Well, I feel like we just got started, but coming to the end of time for today. So I think, there's a whole world more to talk about. But thank you both for sharing your time, your insights. Really encourage people to go out and grab the book and get into it, because not only have you, I think, done a really structured, layered, thorough job starting from the bottom up of describing science, psychology, and interbehaviorism, but you've also referenced so many other papers that from yourselves, and works from Kantor, and some of Noel Smith's work, that I think is really, really terrific and insightful as well. So I think you could read that book and then just read all your references probably for a couple of decades, pretty easily.
Introduction to also to Kantor's work, as I mentioned, that was kind of our initial aim.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's a really nice way into that work and into Kantor's work. I'll put a link to your book on the in the description of the video. If people want to kind of reach out and ask you more questions, if anyone's got this far into the conversation, what's the best way to get in contact with you, if you want people contacting you? If you don't, that's fine.
Sure. You have email address, my email address.
Yeah, it's okay. You can put the email address that you have. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you both so much for your time this morning, this afternoon, your time. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hope we can continue it sometime.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, Linda.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Okay.